Now, self-enforcing contracts that we were talking about in the last video, these only really work if there's the threat of one party ending the agreement or ending the relationship. And so what we can think of these self-enforcing contracts and the threat of terminating the employment contract, we can think of this as sort of taking the stick approach in the sense that we're trying to use the threat of loss to compel people to do things, right? But we can also use sort of the carrot approach where we reward good behavior and try to motivate employees to do their job well and motivate employers not to be mean or motivate the employer to do a good job as an employer, right? So how can we create a system of rewards that reward good behavior and don't reward bad behavior, okay? So one way that we can do it is we can, sort of pay for performance, right? We can pay people for performance, which is essentially what commission pay is, okay? And so we see a lot of this in sales offices, right, where it's tough for employers to monitor exactly how hard a salesperson tries to complete a sale, but it's relatively easy for the employer to count the number of sales they successfully negotiate. Or think about waiters and waitresses, right? They're paid primarily based on tips because the restaurant owner wants to make sure that the waiter and waitress are serving their customers well, right? And so better service leads to better or higher tips, and so thus we're sort of tying the employee's pay to their performance, right? Now what's strange, at least to me, right, is that nobody tends to tip their college professor, right? And so if you want to change that, by all means, I accept tips, not bribes. I accept tips, right? And so, we see this, sort of paying for performance, right? Paying based on commission or getting tips at restaurants, right? These are all forms of paying the employer, paying the employee based on their performance, okay? Now there are two drawbacks to this, right? So we'll call them negatives, right? One is that there may be factors beyond the control of the employee that affect productivity. Okay, so for example, right, college kids are notoriously bad tippers at restaurants, right? And I don't cause that to be true. I'm just reporting facts, right? The average college student is a terrible tipper. Excuse me, hang on. There we go. Sorry about that. I'll just turn that on silent. There we go. Okay. And so college students are typically terrible tippers, right? And so as a result, right, your server might not work as hard at serving college students as they might if you were not a college student, right? And so we see this, fairly frequently, right? We see young people tend to not get great service at restaurants, and people who are older and dressed nicely tend to get great service, right? Or what about a factory that experiences very frequent breakdowns in their machine, right? Salespeople who are paid on commission might not put forth all that much extra effort if they know that the factory won't be able to meet their additional orders, right? And so as a result, there may only be very weak incentives to employees to increase their effort if there are significant factors beyond their control that influence how much more pay they'll actually receive, right? And second, right, the second potential weakness or the second negative is that we need to pick output measures, right? So we need to pick actual output measures that coincide with what employers actually want. As a bonus or as an addendum, they also must be easy to detect or observe. Okay? And so quantitative measures are easy to track. You just count whatever happens, right? Then qualitative measures. But using quantity as your basis for judging performance could lead to reduced quality, right? So for example, imagine that you're a bag handler for Delta Airlines and that Delta paid you based on the number of bags that you got off the plane, right? What would you want to do, right? Well, you'd want to maximize the number, and you might end up just hopping on the plane and throwing bags off of it as quickly as you possibly can, right? The result would just be a big pile of bags on the tarmac, things in the bags possibly being broken or damaged, right? And all sorts of other things, right? Or maybe they'd be lost because you damaged the sticker on them, right? All kinds of bad things. Or what if you worked for Ford and they paid you based on the number of cars you produced per day, right? By trying to get as many cars done as quickly as possible, you might end up sacrificing the quality of the cars, making them less safe or more likely to break down, which would in turn make customers less likely to buy them, right? And so picking the way that you're going to measure output, if you're going to pay people based on that output, right, is a hugely important task. What you want to avoid is incentivizing employees to spend their time doing things that are being measured instead of doing things that are actually valuable, right? But we can also do sort of time-based pay, right? We can have time-based pay with supervision, right? And what this is saying is that, we're paying people for their time, right? Not their output, right? Now this reduces the effect of outside influences affecting someone's productivity and therefore their compensation, and as a result, workers will be happier. But doing this creates what we call a moral hazard. Right? Where a moral hazard is basically the idea that the employee has a strong incentive to shirk, right? Because they're being paid the same amount no matter how much they produce, so why bother producing as much as they possibly can, right? And so the question would be, why should someone work hard if their extra hard work isn't being rewarded with extra pay, right? Now the danger here is that that workers would only sort of put in their time and then go home as soon as their shift is done, regardless of how much they have actually accomplished that day, right? And so what you need then is supervision, right? And so another problem with time-based pay is that it requires a supervisor. right? And the problem with supervision is that it's costly, right? So this costs money and time, right? So tasks in every workplace are divided so that workers can specialize in what they're good at and contribute more to the workplace. However, employees must also continually adjust to changing situations within their areas of responsibility. And so close supervision would require that the supervisors have the same information as the workers at the same time as the workers on all the situations that all of their employees are facing and be able to judge each decision accurately in real time. Okay? But if this is true, then the supervisor might as well just make all the decisions for everyone and just command everyone to do whatever is right. And as a result, this would destroy the division of labor and all the advantages of specialization, right? And so the supervisor, right, is not only someone who has to be hired to watch you, right? So let's imagine that I had a supervisor here at Ferris, right? Well, what that would mean is that there'd be some guy or girl right over there, right? Here we go, right over there, right? Okay, standing in the corner, making sure that I was doing my job right now, right? Well, that person's not really doing anything for Ferris. They're just making sure that I'm doing something for Ferris, right? And so that sort of system, right, where we're having one person do the work and another person watching, right, is just wasting, sort of, right? It's wasting one person's time. And then we could also, if we didn't want to cut the Gordian knot, right, we could also say, well, we have to have someone watch the supervisor to make sure that the supervisor is supervising the supervisee, right? And we'd have to have someone watch that person's supervisor. And so you run into a sort of, who watches the watchman type of scenario, right, where we're going to need to have an infinite number of supervisors, right? Which maybe that's why we have an increase in college administrators. Maybe that's what's going on. We just have constant supervision, right? Who knows? Okay, and so one problem is that it costs money and time, right? But another problem, which I was talking about just before, is the idea that the supervisor must know, what constitutes doing the job, right? And if you've got a job that kind of changes over time, that changes over perhaps even day to day, right? Your supervisor would have to understand that so that they could correctly supervise you, right? What we want to avoid is having a supervisor punish you for doing the right thing or reward you for doing the wrong thing, right? And this becomes especially difficult as what constitutes right and wrong are constantly changing, right? Especially in the context of a business, right? Where, maybe it's correct to upgrade, this one particularly irate guest to the penthouse suite, but it doesn't make sense to upgrade another person, another also equally irate guest to a penthouse suite, right? Those sort of judgment calls that the employee could make, but the supervisor might not be able to make, would matter and do matter, right? And so we would need the supervisor in that scenario to have the same experience and knowledge and ability as the employee, but if they did, then we might as well just have them be the employee, right? And so time-based pay with supervision might solve some of the problems over here, but it creates some new problems over here, right? And so we need to understand the particulars of each individual firm and which one is going to be more costly, right? And so if you have a scenario where the factors there aren't very many factors that affect someone's productivity, and the right job is constantly changing all the time, right? Or the job requires very specific knowledge, right? It might make sense to pay people by performance instead of based on time, right? And so we see this in particular with let's see, with barbers, right? Barbers are typically paid by performance, right? They're paid per haircut that they do, right? And the reason why is because there's not very many factors that can affect their productivity, right? Other than the number of customers that come in, right? And there's also each individual haircut is going to be very unique, right? And there's a big moral hazard, right? You want to basically, if you're the barbershop owner, right? You don't want the barber, the hairstylist, right, to be, dilly-dallying with one customer all day. You want them to get the customers done, right? You want them to get the customers done correctly, but you also just want them to get them done and get on to the next one, right? And so paying by performance in the barber industry sort of makes sense, right? At the same time, paying in a time-based way with supervision makes sense for teachers, because we don't want teachers to sort of run around trying to maximize the number of students that they interact with, and at the same time, or by extension, minimizing the amount of time and effort they put into their classrooms, right? We want them to do the right thing, and we want them to do their job well. And in this case, right, supervision isn't that difficult, because what changes in the material or the things that change are very small, right? Which I'm sure you've noticed when you use, old versions of textbooks, right? I'm willing to bet the old version of the textbook was perfectly fine in terms of the content, right? Maybe the problems at the end of the chapter were different, but the content was certainly the same. And so the supervisor of the teacher or educator or professor would probably have the requisite knowledge in order to know what was the right and what was the wrong thing, right? And so in different scenarios, different payment systems make better sense, okay? Now, let's move on to talking about group work, right? And so with group work, we run into a whole host of problems, right? And so problems with payment and rewards are especially prevalent in group settings, right? As we were talking about earlier, with your high school experiences, right? So I'm sure you had at least one person in your high school group that didn't quite do their fair share of the work, right? Or maybe you were the one, like I was, who would just say, screw it, I'm not leaving this to chance, so I'll just do it myself and we'll be fine, right? And so the problem here is that groups are made up of individuals, and individuals are the ones that have to decide how much effort they're actually going to put forth, right? In situations where extra individual effort results in extra group output and pay, and the extra group pay is divided amongst the group, each individual is necessarily only getting a fraction of the return on their extra effort, okay? And so let's sort of work through example number 2, right? And so let's say, there's 5 people, so there's, person A, B, C, D, and E, right? And if each person would work 10% harder, then the group will collectively be 50% more productive, and everyone will receive 10% more pay. So 10% effort yields a 10% bonus, right? And that's true for everyone, right? All the way down the line, okay? But now suppose that, person B, right? B for a word that starts with B and means, not a nice person, right? Person B realizes that if they don't work harder, right, the group will increase their productivity by 40%, right? And since they're splitting the extra pay evenly, right? Person B can work 0% harder and receive an 8% bonus, right? And so now what this person has to decide is not, is it worth working 10% harder for 10% more pay, but is it worth working 10% harder for only 2% more pay, right? So would you put in 10% more effort to get 2% more money, right? And you know what? You might decide that that's not worth it. Now, in very small groups, cheating is probably very easy to detect and punish within the group through social pressures and moral suasion, right? But in large groups, or in groups where cheating is hard to detect, this can be a nightmare. Right? One form of social pressure that you guys use all the time is called gossip, right? If people are talking badly about you behind your back or in private, right, you'll quickly develop a reputation for being lazy, and people will be less likely to work or to want to work with you in the future, right? Some employers end up banning workplace gossip in an effort to make the workplace feel safer, right? Now, I'm not going to comment on whether or not this is a good idea or a bad idea on net, but it is interesting, from an economic point of view, that gossip has emerged as a means of putting social pressure on people, and that some employers have actually banned this practice, right? And so we need to be cognizant of the cost associated with giving up gossip, namely that we lose an ability to sort of apply social pressure to people, right? But there's also unproductive gossip, which we won't discuss in this class, right? That's a topic for a different class and probably a different professor, or maybe a round table. Okay.